So good afternoon. My name is Myroslav Shkandrij. I'm a professor emeritus of Slavic Studies at the University of Manitoba. I'm delighted you could join us today for the ROM Connects program, which is generously supported by the Schmidt family. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation since time immemorial to today. I'm delighted you could join us for today's program in support of ROM's digital project, Ukraine, Identities, Culture, and Resilience. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter for helping this program occur. In 2019, a team from ROM traveled to Ukraine to interview Ukrainians on the subject of identity and culture. Canada is home to the second largest Ukrainian diaspora, and in recognition of the deep connection many Canadians of Ukrainian descent have with Ukraine, today's conversation explores some of the diverse experiences with Ukrainian-Canadian identity through the voices of our guests. During today's program, you can submit questions for us via the Q&A feature on the screen, and we will leave time at the end of our discussion for the Q&A. I'd like to introduce the three guests. Denys Volkov works as an executive director of the Association of Manitoba Municipalities. He impacts rural and urban communities alike by raising awareness of democracy and the importance of free and fair elections domestically and abroad. Previously, Denys was employed in the mayor's office of the city of Winnipeg. He served as director of communications and election observer during Canada's elections observation missions to Ukraine in 2014 and 2019. In Winnipeg, he helped to produce a documentary on the Holodomor, the man-made famine in Ukraine, in 1932-33, which was presented to the former president of Ukraine and the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. Denys previously lived in the United Kingdom and Ukraine. Dr. Olenka Bilash is a descendant of the early pioneer settlers who left Austro-Hungary, now Western Ukraine, in 1896. While studying at the University of Winnipeg, she discovered a national Ukrainian student club and went on to learn Ukrainian, a language she has passed on to her children and grandchildren. She currently serves as a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta and is the acting director of the Ukrainian Language Education Center at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta. Alexandra Chyczij has served as the president of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress since 2018. This is the umbrella organization uniting and advocating on behalf of Canada's 1.4 million Ukrainian Canadians. Alexandra is a lawyer by profession and for over 25 years has led prominent legal associations like the Advocates Society and the Canadian Corporate Counsel Association. So I'd like to welcome Denys, Olenka, and Alexandra. Thank you for making time for us in your schedule and for sharing some of your personal and family experiences as a Ukrainian Canadian. I'm going to ask two questions, basically. It's over 130 years since the first large wave of Ukrainian immigrants arrived in Canada. Since then, there have been several waves that have created a diverse Ukrainian-Canadian community. So the first question is, how do you personally situate yourself with respect to this immigration history? Do you see your personal and family history as linked to a particular immigration? And if so, how does this affect your sense of identity? And my follow-up question will be about the war in Ukraine and how this has whether this has changed your perceptions of Ukrainian immigration. Perhaps Olenka would like to go first, since her link is to the earliest emigration.
Thank you. Well, as Myroslav mentioned in the introduction, my descendants came from Ukraine, what was then known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1896. Needless to say, I never met them, but I did grow up with a baba, a grandmother who did not speak English. And my father's first language, the youngest of 7 children, was Ukrainian. So when he went to school, he and all of his siblings in a small rural part of Manitoba were highly discriminated against. And as he grew older, with a grade 3 education, he moved to the city because unfortunately the homestead that they were allotted grew, as he said, only stones. And when I eventually saw the Interlake area of Manitoba, I realized that was the truth. My father spoke Ukrainian, they sang Ukrainian. We grew up with Ukrainian foods, celebrating Easter and Christmas as major points in the calendar year. But he never passed the language on. Perhaps that's because my mother is not Ukrainian. And in fact, my mother is the daughter of both Irish immigrants, 5 generations, and more recent British immigrants. My mother was disowned by her mother for marrying a Ukrainian. That was the British side. And so I really grew up with a strong sense of family from the Ukrainian side, and therein my Ukrainian identity. And perhaps because of the story of being disowned, I always grew up with the sense of not all people are equal. And unfortunately, the Ukrainians have some kind of a scar against them. Nevertheless, I did go to university. I was the first person in the whole extended family to graduate high school. And that was more a reflection of perhaps finances and perhaps a very strong work ethic. As soon as you can, go out and work and earn money and contribute. While at university, I was studying languages. And one day, literally in November, I looked out and I said, okay, well, I'm learning French and I'm learning German, but I'm Ukrainian and I don't really know anything about it. Unfortunately, the university where I went did not teach Ukrainian, but as Myroslav also mentioned, I started to learn Ukrainian and joined a Ukrainian students club. That was a foray into quite a different world for me. A world that was filled with daily lessons of what it was to be Ukrainian from different waves of immigration, and also what it was to function totally in the Ukrainian language at home. And that was new to me. I should say also that my youth was spent becoming aware of the fact that being Ukrainian, having a Ukrainian identity, was meant only for the home. And in public, I was like a normal mainstream blue collar kid until 1971, when Canada adopted multiculturalism. And I recall very clearly having suddenly had assignments in school where I was asked to talk about my heritage. So that was, I think, quite a legitimizing point. This object is a trunk, the trunk that my godfather brought, or his family brought from Ukraine. And I started to try to clean off the green tar. It was a very thick tar that was designed not to get wet on the boat coming over from Hamburg to Halifax. I think of this object actually as being precious in a number of ways. Everything that they brought was in this trunk. It was heavy, and it was filled not just with those objects, but in their own way, their memories. And I think they knew they'd never go back, but they brought the songs of longing to go back. Sorry. Just to go on a little bit, I'll talk about the object again with the next question, if I may. I didn't grow up with any symbols of being Ukrainian. Never ever saw a piece of embroidery. There is nothing Ukrainian in the house, except perhaps a photo of my great-grandparents in my aunt and uncle's house. However, that aunt and uncle in the 1970s went to Ukraine on a tour. And that then started to bring a few objects, symbols of Ukrainian identity into the home. I have since gained the language. I have passed that on to my children and grandchildren, as was mentioned. And my children were raised in what I call the organized Ukrainian community. Organized because there's Ukrainian schools, there are, of course, churches and church organizations, there's Ukrainian language scouts, and so their identity was a part of this organized community.
And of course, and you're a big part of that organized community now. You're very important in teaching Ukrainian to Canadians. So perhaps we could just move on to and come back to in a moment to Alexandra, who has a connection to a different wave of emigration. Alexandra, you're muted.
Yes, I know that famous. We need a sign for that. So thank you. I am the child of World War II refugees, so I bring that perspective. And I have to say that for the last year, I have felt a sense of deja vu all over again, because what is happening now is so reminiscent of what happened to my family. But even though I was born in Canada, I was raised on the stories of my family's experience during World War II. You know, they spoke of the pain of leaving loved ones behind, never to be seen again, the tragedy and hardships of the refugee experience, and then, of course, the challenges of establishing a new life in Canada. So just for some context for those who may not be familiar, during World War II, the front moved through and across Ukraine several times. As Timothy Snyder called it, you know, Ukraine is the bloodlands. And so Ukraine was subjected to two occupations. First, the Soviet, the Nazis, and then, of course, when the defeat of the Nazis paved way for a return to Soviet terror to Ukraine, millions fled to Western Europe. And that's what happened to my mother's family. They found themselves in a labor camp in Germany, where my mother was forced to work in a munitions factory. We believe, the family believes, that, you know, her exposure to heavy metals in that factory perhaps predisposed her to Parkinson's, which she battled with later in life. And my mother told us the story that, you know, in between factory shifts, she was responsible for taking care of her 3-year-old brother and her elderly grandfather. And to this day, to the day she died, the sound of sirens visibly traumatized her as she remembered that experience. At the end of the war, my mother's extended family was reunited in Austria, but that was a short-lived joy, because she very quickly after that lost her 3-year-old brother to diphtheria, and her elderly Didus died. So my mother herself also was hospitalized with scarlet fever. I mean, the medical conditions were quite primitive. And while she was in hospital, she witnessed the death throes of Eastern Ukrainians who had attempted to commit suicide by drinking wood grain alcohol to avoid forcible repatriation to the Soviet Union. And that was called Operation Keelhaul. Some historians consider it to be a war crime of World War II that has yet to be addressed. So eventually my mother's family immigrated to Toronto. She met my father at the wedding of a mutual friend. They married and they had 3 daughters. I am the eldest of them. My parents and grandparents who lived with us told their stories to us very deliberately. They imbued us with a love for a homeland that we had never seen, and most of us wouldn't see until Ukraine gained its independence. And of course, that many of them would never see again. And because of the brutality of the Soviet occupation that they had experienced, and then the relentless Russification policies of the Soviet regime, they believed that we were carriers of the genetic code that would ensure the survival of the Ukrainian people. And so we spoke only Ukrainian at home. I didn't learn English until I was old enough to go out and play on the street with friends. I went to school at the first in Canada Ukrainian Heritage School that was established by my parents' generation in Toronto. I attended Plast Ukrainian Scouts, an organization that had migrated to Canada along with many of its founders and early members. I sang in a Ukrainian choir, and most of my friends are grateful that I did not take up Ukrainian dance. So I visited Ukraine for the first time in '89, and my uncles took me to our ancestral home in Chyczij, the home of my great-grandparents, where I found what can only be described as a shrine to us, the family in Canada, the family photographs and letters that my grandmother had sent to them. And of course, at that time, they were smuggled through an intermediary in Poland, because any connection with the corrupt Western bourgeoisie at that time could have dispatched my grandmother's family to the Gulag. So they carefully preserved and filed all of those letters. And when I came there, I was allowed to read them. And the raw emotion, sorry, this is very difficult to speak of. It showed me the longing that my grandmother had, how she terribly missed her family. So when I returned home, I spoke to my grandmother about this, and she shared the letters that she had received. And she kept them in this box, which you see on the screen. And that's the box that my grandparents sent to us in Canada for their golden wedding anniversary in 1959. They wanted us to see them, to share themselves, to be a part of our lives. So that artifact to me symbolizes the linkage to my Ukrainian family.
Very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Denys, you come from an entirely different world, but you have now become part of the Ukrainian-Canadian emigre and immigrant experience.
Myroslav, and thank you for the invitation. Both questions are very important, and thank you, Myroslav, for saying that my experience is different, because you and I have talked many times, and pictures today will be from my home city of Kharkiv, Ukraine, where I was born, in the second largest city, which unfortunately right now has been bombed every day since this war started. But I'm very proud of my city, and my roots that I'm talking about today take me to the city which is already very diverse. Some say it's a student capital of Ukraine. There are a lot of research facilities, universities, and a very diverse workforce. I come from a very different background of people of Jewish, Ukrainian, and Russian descent. And for many years, even now, as I was reflecting on what I'm going to be talking about today, I felt it's important to say that I wasn't brought up in Ukrainian culture. It's important to say that my parents were born in the Soviet Union. My great-grandfather was killed during Holocaust. So the influence of the Jewish culture on my family has always been very strong. And in the Soviet Union, especially in Eastern Ukraine, where majority of people in Kharkiv speak Russian, I grew up as a Russian speaker as well, was heavily influenced by Russian music, Russian culture. And I only started discovering my sort of connection to Ukraine later in life. And in fact, I would say that my love for Ukraine grew over the years already as I was sort of a formed adult, or later in my teen years when I was learning Ukrainian culture in school, when I was independent now Ukraine after 1991, participating in various events. And I really enjoy learning about Ukrainian culture when I came here to Canada, because I first of all feel the influence of first waves of immigrants. We just heard the two previous speakers talking about that. And I'm very proud to be a part of the Ukrainian community here in Canada, because I feel that we can all learn from the past and we can build on that past to influence the future, especially now when we're watching sort of horrible images of the Russian invasion right now in Ukraine. And then I see my city, the beautiful pictures you see today. And that's not what it looks like today in many ways, even though I took these pictures only 3 years ago on my last trip to Ukraine right before COVID. So, and I just did ancestry.ca tests, and again it confirmed to me what I sort of knew, that I'm influenced by sort of different cultures, different ethnic backgrounds, and grew up and always questioning what I guess identity I belong to. And every time I see Ukrainians in Ukraine fighting for independence, it just reaffirms in me that I'm very proud to be from Ukraine. I'm very proud to be from Kharkiv, Ukraine. And I'm very proud to participate in what I believe the global fight, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire world against sort of evil empire, which is trying to destroy the country. This picture is with my father here, who still lives in Kharkiv. He refuses to leave even now. And his story would be very, I believe, similar to the way I described to you my story. And he's become a big supporter of the Ukrainian state over the years, when he sees that the country that is next to them is really destroying livelihood of people, destroying civilian infrastructure, bombing homes. So that's how I grew up with. And fast forward to today, I really identify myself as Canadian Ukrainian, and I'm proud of my Jewish roots. I'm proud to grow up in a culture where already from early age understood that sort of there are people from different backgrounds and you all have to get along. So I really, again, want to conclude that I really appreciate this invite, and I really appreciate the questions that Professor Shkandrij is asking. So I really look forward to questions from the audience as well. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Well, that's great. We have 3 perspectives, all very interesting. Just before we get to the questions, I wanted to do the follow-up question and ask all of you. The war in Ukraine obviously has had a profound effect, not just on the Ukrainian-Canadian community, but on the global community. How does this new wave of immigration that is now taking place, or temporary visitors from Ukraine, how has it changed your views of past immigrations, or your sense of Canadian identity, or your relationship to Ukraine? Could you tackle those? Denys has spoken a little bit about that already, but I'm curious how Olenka and Alexandra respond to the influence of the present wave of immigration and the present events on Ukrainian Canadians.
I guess I'll go first. I think that the audience has probably heard some of the complexity of the Ukrainian community. It's not, although it can be united in many ways, it's very diverse, as you've just heard. My first response is actually, I'm going to just hold up a Ukrainian flag for a moment. And the reason for that is that I had occasion to travel by car in April across the prairies from Edmonton to Winnipeg. And the number of Ukrainian flags that I saw on the corners of farmyards, not on houses, but where you wouldn't even know where people lived, was almost astonishing. And those were flags that you wouldn't have seen prior. So they were signs of support for Ukraine in this horrible invasion. And they were also signs of Ukrainian identity. My brother, who does not speak Ukrainian but was in the military, was willing to go to Ukraine to fight. And that's from a certain generation of people that did not grow up in what I earlier called the organized community. But from the perspective of the newest immigration, I think that there have been some positives. For example, the children who've come have been very welcomed into many of the Ukrainian community activities over the summer, and they've been able to attend camp with Canadian Ukrainian children, and they've had common language that they can share. On the negative side, I don't think the trauma has actually hit everyone yet, and that as a community, we have to be prepared to provide support to these young people who, even though they are physically safe, they are listening daily to news reports with knowing that family members are in danger. So I think that the war has reinforced Ukrainian identity for me and for the public and for my generation or wave of immigration. But it's also helped us to realize the kinds of supports that we need to provide to refugees that came before those who came from Ukraine. I think that we are empathetic, and we could hear about refugees from Syria or from Afghanistan, but did we really understand those experiences? I think not, but now we do.
Very interesting. Alexandra. Are you muted?
Almost a year ago, when the first US and UK intelligence reports started telling us that there was going to be a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as the leader of the Ukrainian-Canadian community, we began to prepare. It was almost as if we, and in particular myself, the child of World War II refugees, had been preparing for this moment my entire life. My entire upbringing led me to this moment. And suddenly the stories of my parents and grandparents took on a completely new meaning. It was a new reality. We were living their nightmare all over again. And so we followed suit. We followed the example that the previous generation of Ukrainian Canadians gave us in welcoming my parents' generation to Canada, and we began to mobilize to help. The effort has been absolutely massive. Since the beginning of the year, Canada has welcomed over 100,000 displaced persons from Ukraine. Every province, every city, every organization has a settlement team in place. We welcome new arrivals at major airports across Canada. We help them find housing, jobs, furniture, clothing, get them settled in our schools, and we do everything that we can to ease their burden, including provision of psychological support where necessary. We've raised money just through the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress and the Canada-Ukraine Foundation. We've raised almost $50 million. There's been an additional almost 50 million for military support for Ukraine. That's just what I've been able to identify. I'm sure it's double or triple that. And we're actually going to try to calculate that sometime soon. But we're really grateful for Canada's support internationally, and that Canadians have opened their hearts and their homes to Ukrainians. And I feel that Ukraine, for the first time, is being heard. People often ask me, why are you fighting? How are you fighting? How are you so persistent? And I say, because we've been doing this for 3 centuries. And in the last century alone, Ukraine has suffered so much hardship. The Holodomor, the Great Famine of 32-33, the Soviet terror. This is nothing new to us. And we as Ukrainians know that this is an existential battle for our very existence as a nation.
And this is, the new immigration has changed the complexion of the Ukrainian community. I think this is a shot in the arm. There are many intelligent people, many creative people who are arriving and are helping to make bonds, links between previous waves of or people who descend from previous waves of immigration. Thank you very much. Denys, final comments on the current situation and how it affects the way people see Ukrainian-Canadians or Ukraine?
Well, tough question. For me, it's very tough because, again, I grew up in Ukraine. I grew up in the city that has been bombed every day. My family and friends are still there. So my experience, I feel, is through the eyes of people who are every day reporting to me what they experience. And I have some friends who moved to Slovakia, Germany, England, and I'm actually helping my university friend who came here to Winnipeg to settle. And I'm very grateful to the government of Canada, province of Manitoba, for setting up amazing services. For example, in Winnipeg, we have a help desk. So if you arrive, there are people who are meeting you at the airport. They're all volunteers. The airport allowed to set up, gave space to set up a desk decorated in Ukrainian colors. As people take pictures there, there's a beautiful sort of this flower arrangement with sunflowers. And then the hotel nearby has a desk with representatives of the federal government who provide help to provide social insurance numbers, representatives from Manitoba Health who help to set up provincial health cards and book a medical appointment, which is required by the federal government for all newcomers. There is a Ukrainian-Canadian Congress is represented there with sort of general information about what's offered in Manitoba, and there is an immigrant center that helps with language courses. So when I see that, to me, absolutely amazing to see sort of those types of supports for newcomers. The experiences, I sort of agree with Olenka. I don't think it hit them yet. Like they are coming here right now thinking, oh, I'm gonna go back very soon. I'm just coming here for a few months. But you know, when I talk to them and look at sort of what's happening, they kind of starting to hit them later. Then they're starting to settle here. Canadians open houses for them, for many people to sort of settle just for maybe a few weeks or a few months. And then they have to look for more permanent accommodations. They have to look for jobs. So I can see that transition in sort of my friends from I'm going back sort of next week to my hometown to now thinking I might never go back, or I might go back many months later. So it's a developing. It's a good question because it's sort of very, relevant. It's developing right now, and I feel I'm very affected personally just because it's affecting my family and friends, and I'm hearing firsthand directly from them about some of their struggles. And everybody's trying to help fundraise, influence sort of politicians at all levels to make sure that supports are provided. So it's a really ongoing challenge right now. But thank you for the question.
That attitude of I'm going back soon, that's very typical, very, very typical of any political emigration or any emigration that is a forced emigration. It's been experienced over and over again by Ukrainians. One theme that's coming through very strongly is, at least to me, is this idea that the war is making patriots of Ukrainians who never really seriously thought about being Ukrainian or being patriotic. Is that how you see it, Olenka?
I certainly think there's a raising of consciousness. I think the question of patriotism in a global world itself needs to be unpacked, but I think there's definitely increased consciousness, and perhaps again with people from my wave, an opportunity to express something deep inside them that they might not have had a chance to express before. What makes someone Ukrainian?
Right,
So,
or think about
Ukrainian-Canadian.
Right, and you can be both a Ukrainian patriot and a
Absolutely,
patriot of
yeah.
Ukrainian-Canadian life of Canada. Alexandra.
Well, I think those of us who follow this know that one of the great jokes in Ukraine now is the unintended consequences of Putin's war, where he has, united Ukrainians like they've never been united before. And I think that certainly in Canada, we are very fortunate that we have a united community. We've understood that we need to speak with one voice. And so but the way that the community has rallied has been inspirational to me. And I think we as Ukrainian-Canadians are very fortunate to have that gene that someone described as the beehive gene, where we just come together and we self-organize and we figure it out and we get it done. But I want to come back to something Olenka has said, and that is the parallels with other refugee populations. Even though Ukrainians don't qualify technically under the convention as refugees because we are not being persecuted by our own homeland, and many do want to return home, as Denys said. So, but, we haven't received the same supports that other refugee populations have, but that's where the community has stepped in. And certainly various levels of government have understood that that they need to step up and help. And that has been just overwhelming and so gratifying.
I want to get to the question and answer, and I'm sure all of you can say a few words in response to the questions. First, I want to thank Olenka, Alexandra, and Denys for joining today's program and for exploring and sharing their own experiences. I'm going to share a couple of questions that have turned up on the screen. I may not be able to get to all of them, so I apologize for that. But one of them is this: can you explain the dichotomy of Canada actively recruiting Ukrainians to settle the prairies, but then many of them settling in the interlake region of Manitoba, a land full of stones? This seems to be to Olenka.
Well, when the first immigrants arrived by boat in Halifax, they registered and they were given or chose a card that had some coordinates on it. And those coordinates were a latitude and longitude that would eventually take them to the homestead that they would settle. Different immigration officers would greet them. So you could have two brothers whose family names were spelled differently, and yet they were still brothers. So there were lots of interesting anomalies in that. When they got to their, they traveled then by train as far as they could, in this case, in my case, to Winnipeg, and then they traveled by foot to look for the homestead, usually 640 acres, that would become their home. That land was raw and virgin land. Of course, we do now know that it was also the land of our First Nations peoples, and many of them were helpful to those first Ukrainian settlers, especially when they came in September and had no idea what a winter on the prairies would be like, and often perhaps would be without a home, and they would build a burde, which was essentially, they would dig a pit in the soil, and they would create a roof out of local trees and branches and grass, and put as much on it for insulation as possible. When some of the land was excellent, we know that much of the prairies is what we consider the breadbasket of Canada, just as Ukraine has been considered the breadbasket of Europe, but not all of that land was ideal for agriculture.
And of course, they would only find out once they began clearing it. At that point, it became obvious where the best land was. The second question, if I may, what are your views of the impact of this latest migration on organized Ukrainian-Canadian institutions? For example, the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, Plast, Zoom, UNO, churches, etc. That has to be a question to Alexandra. And again,
That somehow that button keeps popping back. I think it's had a very positive impact. I think that many of our organizations, all of them have stepped up and organized various programs for newcomers. The Ukrainian National Federation ran a respite program for mothers and children, where they provided 5 days up at the lake north of Toronto, where mothers and children could decompress in a safe atmosphere. Plast and SUM offered camps for children, and many other organizations, church organizations. And the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress is embracing newcomers because we have found funding to bring some of those individuals to our Congress, our triennial Congress, which is taking place in Winnipeg. Denys, we'll see you soon, this coming weekend. And I think it's important to integrate them into our community structures as quickly as possible so that they feel truly welcomed by us.
but has that changed them? I mean, many of these people are from Eastern Ukraine and they're Russian speaking, or they have a very different cultural experience. Does that create tensions in established Ukrainian communities, or is it changing those established Ukrainian communities? I see Denys has his hand up. Maybe he can answer.
Well,
that.
I'll try to tackle this. Is, as you know, Myroslav, a very good question because I speak Russian as my first language, and I understand. I meet some of the people, and it's a very tricky situation. They do sometimes feel that they're excluded by some members of the Ukrainian community. So it's very important to bridge the gap. And it's important to make sure to understand people coming right now from Eastern Ukraine who even didn't want to leave their homes, but they were forced to leave their homes, that there has to be a different way for the Ukrainian community like us to integrate them. And again, just for the context of what I'm talking about, I was watching a documentary on defenders of Donetsk airport from a few years ago. 50% of those Ukrainian soldiers on the front line fighting Russians were speaking Russian language. I already lost 2 of my classmates who were killed in this current conflict. They spoke Russian, and in fact, they when people challenged them on that, they were strong in their views of, you know, you can be a Ukrainian patriot and you can be defending your country and still speak Russian. So it's a very complex thing for even our own community here in Canada, Ukrainian community, to understand. So every day, I would say, when I talk to members of our community here, that I try to explain that we need a different approach to bring people, to invite them, feel them welcome in Ukrainian community in Canada. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, on that note, there are a couple of other questions. One is, does the region of Ukraine that your families have connections with impact your identities? Much is made of the perceived regional differences, Eastern Ukraine versus the Odessa region versus the Western Ukraine. Is your identity, personal identities, are they wrapped up with the place you came from? Denys has got his hand up, yeah?
Well, again, I don't want to hijack the mic, but I feel it does influence for sure, because when I'm hearing Olenka's, Alexandra's stories, very different from some of, let's say, my stories or my friends' stories. Having said that, what Russia is doing is actually uniting people, and you have people from Odessa, Kharkiv, Mariupol, Donetsk, who experience what Russia is doing, actually backing the Ukrainian state.
Okay.
And fighting for their own independence against Russia, even though there are cultural differences. So Ukraine, I feel, Ukrainians are more united than ever right now.
Does anybody else want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think I can add to that is a Kremlin narrative that has, I think, been leveraged by Putin to, emphasize those East-West differences. The East is all Russian speaking, therefore they all want to be part of Russia. I think we have to be very careful of that, and I don't think it's a factor anymore. Denys, the film you mentioned, Kibor, is a fabulous microcosm of Ukrainian society, where it's the story of a platoon that goes in the final days in defense of Donetsk airport. And there's the Western patriot, there's a piano player, there's a Russian speaking mercenary, and they all come together in defense of Ukraine. And I say to our community, when 50 or 60% of the men fighting in the trenches defending Ukraine speak Russian, I'm not giving them a language test.
So on that note of historical reconciliation or support, there's another interesting question. Do you think that the deep historical connections you each have expressed is why there's been an outpouring of support in Canada specifically? Because, Canada is one of the places where people get what's going on and where there is a very profound support. Yep, Olenka.
I definitely do. And I just wanted to add something to the previous question. I think that we cannot dismiss the value of where we're from. Even as Ukrainian-Canadians, there's a very different consciousness if you're from Western Canada versus Central Canada. That doesn't mean that we're not united. It just means that we're different. And so the richness lies in, I think, that diversity. But to answer your question about how that may have influenced the current climate, I think I've missed the question. Myroslav, could you repeat it again?
Well, there are deep historical connections, and does this influence the outpouring of support?
Yes, I think for several reasons. Being a person who was a real advocate for multiculturalism and the extension of multiculturalism, I have worked with many, many ethnic communities in Canada, and Ukrainians are seen as real leaders in this field. People who have fought a battle for everyone. And I think now those everyone's, not just within the Ukrainian community, but beyond, are recognizing that and are coming to support us. And on that note, I wanted to say that at this point, I want to take an opportunity to thank everyone, especially people who don't identify as Ukrainians, for their support against this war. We don't always know who you are, and we don't always extend that gratitude to you. I know there were a couple of Middle Eastern young men in my local community who gathered eyeglasses that they sent to Ukraine. And they did this on their own initiative, not through any organization. So I wanted to say, I think that what we've created as a community and our legacy for 130 years contributes to that outpouring of support.
If I can add to that, I think it contributed to the support, and I certainly have received calls from every group, every ethnic community in the country, corporate Canada, government, but I think it's the sheer barbarism of what is happening that the world is witnessing on television every single night that is driving the support. What is happening is a genocide being broadcast on the television screens in each of our homes every day. And I think that is driving a lot of the support.
Final comment, Denys. We have about 30 seconds left.
No, I echo the two previous speakers. I don't want to prolong this. I think again, thank you for highlighting the question of war in the current context of the identity. I think it's very important. I just want to thank the organizers for that.
Okay, and I'd like to thank all of you too. We'll be wrapping up now for joining us. We hope to see you again for our next digital. Details of all upcoming ROM at-home online programs can be found on the ROM's website and on social media channels. So we hope that today's conversation inspires you to further explore the subject of Ukrainian culture, identity, the Ukrainian-Canadian aspect of that identity through ROM's digital project, which is called Ukraine, Identities, Culture, and Resilience. And it's online now at rom.on.ca. Thank you again to the project team for sharing their experiences this afternoon, and to all of you for making time for us. Enjoy the rest of your day.